Okay, good morning, everyone. This is Jack Kerr, the event coordinator for Willie Street Co-op. We're back with our second installment of the gardening Q&A with our friend Ben Fuda here from PBS's Let's Grow Stuff. So we're going to begin this morning by Ben showing us a video that he's produced on today's topic, of seed starting. So at any point, you can enter a question for us in our chat here on the Zoom. And after the video, we're going to open it up and cover some of the questions that came into us last weekend, as well as some of the email questions we got this week. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ben and get rolling. Thank you, Ben. Good morning.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack. And again, good morning, everyone. I hope you all have your favorite caffeinated beverage handy and close by. I don't know about the weather in Wisconsin, but here it's a beautiful sunny day in Indiana. So it's going to be a great day for gardening. And of course, 70 degrees this week. You know, who needs spring? So anyway, we're going to talk seed starting again today, as Jack mentioned. Again, we're going to start looking at, we have about 15 minutes, a little less than 15 minutes of a prepared video from, again, Let's Grow Stuff that really shows the hands-on and how-to for seed starting, because, you know, as we were thinking about how to do this, seed starting is very hands-on. And so to show and tell really adequately, this video will do hopefully a great, concise job. And then again, we'll get to some Q&A. That said, if you have any issues connection-wise, if your video might be choppy or anything like that, the audio should come through pretty well. If the video's choppy, that link that Jack dropped into the chat right as we began, you know, that you can always go back and rewatch these videos there if for some reason it's a bit choppy for you today. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and we're going to get rolling here with part one, and then we'll jump right to part two.
Greetings from the garden. My name is Ben, and welcome back to a brand new season of Let's Grow Stuff. Well, we're kicking off this season by learning how to start our own plants from seed indoors. So let's jump in and get started. Well, it's a new season, and you may notice a few new things. First, I have hair. Second, because we're getting a jump start on the season, we're filming things indoors. Welcome to my basement. So why do we start things early and from seed? Well, some things just need a jump start on the season because they take longer to mature, and consulting your seed packet is the best way to know what you can start early versus what can just be planted outdoors. Generally speaking, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, and okra all do best when started early. Before we actually get to planting our seeds, let's think about whether starting seeds indoors is the best option for us. Let's talk benefits. When starting from seed, you just have more options for plant varieties. You can grow some really interesting things like heirloom tomatoes, which you can't find at most garden centers. You'll likely save money compared with buying transplants, as a single packet of seeds, which costs just a few dollars, can yield dozens of plants. And you get to experience the pure, wonderful joy of nurturing your own plants from the very beginning of the season. Next, let's go over some other things that you'll need to keep in mind. Seedlings need daily TLC, even if it's just a quick 5-minute inspection. If this daily attention will be a challenge with your schedule, starting seeds may not be the best option for you. Seedlings need bright, direct sunlight. A south-facing window is perfect. But if you have an east or west-facing window, that'll work too. If your only window faces north, you may need to purchase an electric grow light. Think about how many plants you need. If you're growing in limited space in, say, a container, then buying plants from a garden center may simply be an easier choice for you. So once you've considered these points, if starting your own seeds indoors feels like the right option for you, here's how to get started. And before we dig out the soil or pots, we're actually going to begin with a calendar. Do a quick online search to find your frost-free date. If you're growing in the Midwest, this is likely mid to late May. Once you know this date, we'll start working backwards to know when to sow our seeds. Most seed packets have instructions about when and how to sow your seeds, and will use phrases like start indoors 6 weeks before last frost. It's pretty straightforward, but use this information to make a list of everything you're growing, and that will help you know when to plant. Well, now that you know when to start your seeds, here are the basic supplies you'll need. Potting soil. Look on the package and make sure it says that it's rated for seed starting or transplants. Containers or flats for sowing. You can either purchase new cell packs or recycle and reuse common household items like egg cartons or salad boxes. If you're reusing something like an egg carton, make sure it has a small drainage hole in the bottom. Depending on your material, a pencil, hole punch, or X-Acto knife work great for this. A waterproof tray to sit underneath your pots. This will help with watering and with moving your plants. You can use household items like baking sheets for your trays, but just remember they'll be out of commission for a few weeks. You can also check out thrift stores for some of these materials, but make sure they're clean before you begin. Before we add soil to our pots, we need to make sure it's slightly moist first. If your soil needs more moisture, add water a few cups at a time and mix it together until the consistency is just right. And this is where the soil will hold together in our hands, but doesn't drip excess water when we squeeze it. Now that our soil is prepared, fill your containers by dumping a cup or two of soil into the tray at a time and smoothing it over until all spaces are filled. Do not push or pack it down. Here's a quick tip. Do this over a large piece of cardboard or some newspaper so that it's easy to recapture excess soil. And make sure to label your trays so that you know what variety is growing where. Popsicle sticks work great for this, and writing your labels before you start planting can be helpful too. All right, we're nearly there. It's time to plant our seeds. Consult your seed packet to know how deep to plant each type of seed. Make a line with a marker on a pencil to help you make consistent holes. Create a small depression in the center of each container cell. Add 2 to 3 seeds per hole. We do this to increase our chances that every container cell will have a viable transplant. Gently cover each hole with a little extra soil and smooth over the top. All 3 seeds may grow, and that's okay. We'll cover what to do about that in the next episode. Place your seed tray in a warm, sunny location, but make sure it's not on top of a heat vent or radiator because that could dry them out too quickly. Since our soil is already moist, we shouldn't need to add any additional water at this point. But let's talk about watering. As your soil dries out, it's best to water from below by adding about a cup of water to your tray. The pots will wick up the water through the drainage hole in each cell. Wait for all water in the tray to wick up before you add more. Standing water is an indication that your soil is too wet. If you're using city water, make sure to either filter it or let it sit on the counter in an open container for at least 24 hours. This allows chemicals like fluoride and chlorine to evaporate because these chemicals can harm our baby plants. Well, now we wait, and patience is key. Most seeds should germinate within about 7 to 14 days. As your plants emerge and begin to grow, you'll notice them reaching for the light, and you'll be shocked by how quickly they move. Turn your tray 180 degrees every 1 to 2 days, and this will help the stems grow strong and straight. Well, there you have it. You've started your first plants from seed. Congratulations. Now, we'll cover what to do as your plants begin to grow in the next episode, but in the meantime, stay tuned to the Let's Grow.
All right, that is episode. There we go. That is episode 1. We're going to just move right into episode 2, which is of course, what happens next.
Greetings from the garden, and welcome back to Let's Grow Stuff. Today, we're continuing to learn how to start our own plants from seed. So let's jump in and get started. Now, as a reminder, this is the second part of our starting seeds tutorial. So if you haven't put anything in the soil yet, that's totally fine, but we'd recommend you go back and start with that first video before viewing this one. Where did we leave off last time? We just finished planting seeds indoors in our trays and talking about their water needs. Since then, we fast forwarded a few weeks and we have baby plants. These first leaves we see are called Cotyledons. These are the primordial leaves that were stored in the seed, and they help the plant get a jump start on growing. So let's jump ahead another 3 weeks to see our first set of true leaves. These leaves now resemble and better represent what you're growing. It's important to remember not to remove your labels at this point, especially if you're growing multiple varieties of the same plant. So for instance, your tomatoes will probably all look the same until they start to fruit later in the summer. So if you had multiple seeds germinate in a single pot, it's time to thin them. Pick the largest, tallest, and healthiest looking seedling and slowly and gently remove the others. I know this part can feel a little difficult, but it's really important to ensure that you get the healthiest possible plants into your garden. If you left all the plants in every container, they would compete for resources as they grew, and you'd have smaller and weaker plants as a result. After thinning, don't forget to continue rotating your trays every few days and monitor soil moisture. You'll likely need to rotate less frequently as time goes on. So our final step is to do what we call hardening off. And this matters because growing indoors is not the same as growing outdoors. Once our plants move outside, they'll be exposed to more intense light levels, to fluctuations in temperature, and wind. Start hardening off at least a week before you plan to put them in the ground. And as a reminder, your planting date is your frost-free date. Begin to harden off plants by placing them outdoors for 1 hour a day, and gradually increase the amount of time they spend outside by adding about 30 to 60 minutes each day. Don't forget to keep an eye on the weather. If it's going to be chilly or there's high winds, don't bring them outside that day. Well, there you have it. Starting your own plants from seed can be a rewarding endeavor, and it opens up more opportunities for what you're able to grow. As an added bonus, if you happen to start a few extra seeds than you have room for, you can always gift those plants to friends, family, and neighbors. Don't forget, there's more to learn online at pbswisconsin.org/letsgrowstuff. There you can find more helpful videos, tools, tips, and tricks to help you grow a better garden. So until next time.
All right, there, and as I say, there you have it. So we are going to jump over and start hitting our questions here. And maybe Jack, before we do you want to mention anything in terms of what the co-op's carrying in terms of seeds or seed supplies, and maybe where people can go for those?
Sure. I know, excuse me. Our seed provider is a company called, oh gosh, it just went right out of my head, Seed Savers. So we've used them for years, excuse me. And folks can come in and see the wide selection that we have. I was just at East this morning and noticed that we have a huge sale on Purple Cow Organics, soil, topsoil, bedding soil, compost. So really all of the things to get started with this early stage of gardening. So I think it's just a matter of just stopping in and seeing what's there. We do run out of things. So the seeds are very popular. So you're definitely going to want to already be in there shopping for what you think you might like. So
yeah, and I'll mention too, similar, if no one experienced this last year, the same is sort of happening this year. Everyone's gardening, which is beautiful, but that also means it can be really tricky to get your hands on seeds right now. Many seed companies are either sold out or selling out very quickly, or there's a long delay to actually process orders, or they're only accepting orders for half an hour a day, things like that. So again, just, if you're having trouble getting them online or through catalogs, visiting the co-op or other garden centers could be a good way to still look for seeds, but I would not wait. This is not something to put off. If you wait too much longer, there's a chance a lot of things will be sold out. So with that, I will turn it over to Jack for our questions.
Well, actually, that's a good point, Ben, because last week, and then I see in today's chat, there are a few folks that have questions that are kind of about this transition period of we're not actually ready to start putting things into trays because we still have questions about the seeds themselves.
Sure.
So one of the questions that we didn't get to last week, but I definitely wanted to touch on with you this week, was somebody asked, with seed packets, it usually contains more seeds than the average person needs. What is the best way to store those extra seeds? Do you have an idea for storage?
Yes, so seed storage, the sort of three big pieces to look for are cool, dry, and dark. So moisture can encourage plants to grow. Heat can essentially dry out the seeds. They actually have some little bit of moisture held within them to sort of keep them alive. And of course, light can also trigger them to grow prematurely. So those are sort of the factors we want to moderate to sort of keep seeds dormant and keep them preserved as well as we possibly can. And so with that in mind, and pardon the dogs in the background, there's a few different methods you can use. Most seed companies, and actually I can grab one for you and show you here. most seed companies, if you're ordering online, will ship their seeds in sort of this, basically it's a heavy, thick paper envelope. There's no plastic lining, but it has sort of a fuzzy insulating layer on the inside. You can store whatever seeds you don't use, you can sort of just, twist over the tops of those packets. Of course, the seeds don't spill out. And this envelope, you can basically stick it in your vegetable crisper in your fridge. So that keeps them right at that temperature so they don't freeze. The envelope can help to absorb some of that any excess moisture. And of course, it keeps them dark. So even when you open the fridge light, they're in this envelope, and that helps to keep them in the dark. Another option could be, I've seen people using large mason jars and putting, just a little bit of rice, maybe an inch or two in the bottom. You can also use those sort of silicone packs that you get in shoes or other things that they use to keep products dry. Sort of put those in the mason jar, seal it up, and then put that mason jar in, again, a cool and dark place. So if you have a corner of your basement, something that maybe stays around 55, 60 degrees, even during the summer, or even a little chillier. What we don't want is to get them up to like 70 or 80 degrees. The cooler, the better. But we don't necessarily want to freeze them per se. Some seeds can be frozen, for a long period of time, but that's not true of all of them.
Well, when you mentioned refrigerator, I mean, are you saying that we could put them in the refrigerator from now until the start of next season?
Essentially, yeah. So, and again, what I would make sure to do is, especially if you're doing it in your veggie crisper, which is typically a little bit of a better place to be from what I've seen. Check on them too once a month. Make sure that they aren't molding. I've been guilty of putting veggies in there I forget about, and then they start to sort of get a little goopy. And if your envelope or your package is soaking up any of that moisture, transferring them out of it, and just, your mason jar is probably going to be your safer solution, but you can use that envelope that they came in, the shipping envelope themselves, as another option.
I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. Like if you're one of those people that occasionally has goopy lettuce,
yes,
that's the drawer that you want to have your seeds in.
Right. And really I'd say the basement option is probably, if you have a basement, again, a cool or chilly, unfinished basement, that's probably your best solution, because that is going to avoid the possibility, again, of something spilling in the fridge or getting on, especially if you're using an envelope. And again, the mason jar, a little bit of rice, that should keep things nice and cool and dry. And most seeds should stay, if they're stored properly, should, essentially what will happen over time is your germination rate may just go down, because some of those, so if you're planting out those second year seeds next year, instead of doing 2 or 3 per cell, maybe doing 4 or 5. So, there may be fewer that come up. So just increasing the amount of seeds you put in each pot, just to sort of make sure that you still get a viable transplant for each cell. The other option too, is if you have the growing space to grow everything out, this is where, connecting with neighbors, friends, and family, maybe you're the person that grows all the tomatoes and your neighbor grows all the herbs, and you use up all those seeds, but then you share plants among each other. So even if you don't have room for 80 tomato plants, spreading that love of gardening with friends and neighbors and family, and essentially growing plants to give away, as another alternative to just sort of avoid the necessity to save the seeds from now until next year.
The vessels that people put the seeds in, do the seeds need air? Like when you mentioned mason jars, do I want to put the seeds in like things that would have held film, for example? Do they need some airflow?
They don't necessarily need airflow. Again, it's sort of keeping the humidity low is what we want to, and a consistent temperature. If the temperature fluctuates a lot, that's usually what will also trigger them to, that's one of the many triggers to sort of get seeds to break dormancy. So, when we put seeds in the ground and the sun hits the soil, that soil heats up. The soil is dark, it absorbs heat, and that's what will trigger them to grow, among other things. And so we want to try and keep conditions as consistent as possible. So airtight's actually not bad, because if for some reason your air temperature fluctuates, they have a little bit of insulation inside, whatever, and a Tupperware could work too. Just something that's airtight is totally fine. But again, I would still check on them maybe once a month or so, even in that container. Just make sure none of them are molding, make sure nothing got in there. It's amazing what mice and other things can chew. I'd put these in the house. I wouldn't put these in the garage or somewhere where, mice or anything might smell them, because especially if it's in one of these paper envelopes, they'll rip right through it. And so just checking on them to make sure they're doing okay. If you do find any seeds where the packages have molded for some reason, or they don't look so great, just toss them out. It's not a huge loss financially, but you don't want them to contaminate, the rest of what you're trying to save.
Gotcha. All right, great. Well, also in our chat, Gabriel has a question that I think is very related, which is about viability. And is there any, rule of thumb in terms of, vegetables, other things, when you can sort of judge how long seeds might be good for? Or how to
Yeah,
spot them?
I would say usually by year 3 is about the furthest you want to push it. So most seed packets, and I'll see if one of mine has these here, they usually, yeah. I don't know if the camera will be able to focus on this or not. No, it's not really. Well, on this top lip, it essentially says pack for 2021, sell by December 2021. And so seeds will sort of have those expiration dates. And so again, this is saying sell by the end of December. Well, you could really still plant these next spring, and you'll probably, again, your germination rate may not be as great, but in year 2, it won't be too bad. Year 3 is when, again, things I think for most of our common seeds will start to drop off a little bit. Anything that's more than 3 years old, I would just cut your losses. I wouldn't bother holding on to or trying to carry forward. I mean, you can always take a gamble on them and sow them anyway. And you might get 1 or 2 that come through if you want. But you're, again, probably better served to just buy a fresh packet of seeds if they're more than 3 years old.
Okay, that's good to hear. I think I'm guilty of being that garage sale shopper that, you always find somebody who's got bunches of packets of seeds, and it could be 17 years old for all you know.
Yeah, and it could be a fun experiment. Just say, let's see. You really, plants can surprise us, but in terms of if you're like trying to plan a garden and have a productive garden and say I need 12 tomatoes, that isn't the route I would go. The fresher your seeds, certainly the better. But if they're stored properly, 2 to 3 years are usually an okay time frame. Just knowing that with every year, that rate of germination is probably going to go down a little bit.
All right, that's good to hear. Thank you. I hope that answers your question there, Gabriel. Okay, let's move on a little bit here. We did get some other questions that came in that are kind of more about the technicals of doing the indoor seed starting. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I think, it was very insightful to hear about which windows and which light to put your seeds under. But what if you're using grow lights? Can you talk to us a little bit about what you know about that?
Yes, so grow lights, nowadays, if you're buying new grow lights, you're probably seeing 2 options on the market. And the first is LED grow lights. And so these, again, will probably be long strips that are actually if you don't see this on the package, when you turn them on, they'll be like sort of a pinkish purple. And this is because plants actually absorb those wavelengths of light better than just pure white. So they've sort of, and of course they're low energy use because they're LED as well. The other option would be sort of more of the long tubes that, we typically see it in overhead fixtures. If you're using some of those, those might be a little more energy intensive, a little heavier. If they break, of course, that's not fun. But if you are using those, look for any that are rated for daylight spectrum. You don't want warm or cooled. You're looking for daylight, because that's going to have, again, we're trying to simulate outdoor conditions as best we can with these. The biggest mistake I think people make with grow lights is they put them too far away from the seed tray. So baby plants especially, they're able to detect how far they are from their light source. And especially if it's not, the sun obviously is the best light source. And so if you're in direct sun, again, that's why a window on the north side of your house isn't great. It's indirect light. If you want the sun to be beating down on the soil, essentially. So if the light is too far away or too high, and I'll talk about the distances in a second. Essentially what will happen is your plants will get really, really long and skinny, and there'll be a long distance between each one of your leaf nodes. And essentially because the plants are reaching for the light, they're trying to get close to that intense light as quickly as possible. But those long nodes between the seedlings are essentially weak points. The stuff will start to flop over. They'll sort of grow in weird and funky ways, and you'll sort of curse yourself that, like, why don't I have these big, strong looking plants? And again, a lot of it's down to light. So when you're first germinating your seeds, right after you plant, I would have the grow lights about probably 3 to 4 inches off the soil surface. I mean, you almost want it touching. And again, as the plants germinate and start to grow, again, every maybe week or 2, you can lift it by another inch or 2. you still want the plants, you don't want the plants sort of growing up against the light, like, pushing up against them. They don't need to touch, but just sort of keep, moving. Think of it as doing like a reverse limbo. It's like, how low can you go? Well, actually, how high can you go? But we're just sort of, moving them up gently and slowly. And by the time, right now is about the perfect, we're about, again, 6 to 7 weeks out today from most of our frost-free dates. So like this weekend is actually a great time to start most of our seeds. Don't worry about, if you have about 12 inches of clearance from the top of your tray to the maximum height of your light, you're fine. Most things between now and when you'll start planting outdoors will not outgrow that. If you'd started growing a month ago when we filmed that episode, we had to sort of be ahead of the curve to film. Those plants are going to be really big, bigger than most of us would probably have. So.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm pretty new to growing indoors myself. This is only going to be my third go at it, and I think I made the mistake a lot of people make, which is that you don't have the grow lights as close as they need to, and you see that leggy growth, and you think you're doing a great job because they're long and healthy, but then it didn't seem like they made it through that hardening stage.
Yeah.
So, is there something, is there like kind of do you want them low and wide instead of tall and length?
Yep. So and of course, when they start growing, remember we're at the seedling stage. And so it's all about scale. And so from those cotyledons to the first set of true leaves, and it really does depend on the plant, but if it's sort of an inch, half an inch to an inch, an inch might be pushing it. If you have an inch gap between those again, cotyledons first set of leaves, that might be telling you your light source is too far away. We're looking for something maybe closer to a half an inch range, but of course out in the garden, the gap between leaf nodes could be 3 to 4 inches, but that's also when we've got a 3 to 4 foot plant. So scale, sort of matters in this context. Something else to think about if you're growing, and we have a session coming up on cut flowers. I think it's our last one that we're doing in these Saturday sessions, but I'll mention it now because it's relevant for seed starting. If you're growing things like zinnias, cosmos, any of those sort of cut flower plants, when the plants reach about 4 inches, just pinch off the top growing point, just maybe again, half an inch or so. And essentially what that'll do is it'll delay flower production by a week or two, but what it does is create a bushier plant. And so that lower 4 to 6 inches where you pinched off, that will become really sort of woody and stocky over the course of the growing season, and it'll produce a lot of side shoots, which is where you'll get 2, 3, 4, 5 times the volume of flowers you would have gotten if you just let it go straight up. So it's sort of something to know, again, now preemptively at the beginning of the season. Most other plants you shouldn't, peppers and things you could sort of pinch off as well to encourage them to branch, because I've seen that with folks too, is they'll start peppers inside and you've just got like a tree trunk, like a single stem that'll maybe throw off 2 or 3 peppers. But if you pinch off that top nub when it's, again, at 4 to 6 inches high, it'll start to put out side shoots. Again, it might delay fruiting by a week or two, but you're going to have a lot more flowers, a lot more potential production out of that one plant. And the other thing I'll note on that too is, we say to start hardening off a couple of weeks before planting out, but this week, again, for us in Indiana, it's going to be in the mid 70s. I have seedlings on my windowsill. I'm going to start bringing them out now. I don't want to plant them outside yet because, again, it could still frost in the next month or so. But if it's that warm and it's going to be a beautiful sunny day, low winds, taking them outside for an hour or two just to get as much direct sunlight, actually, because even sunlight coming through a window in our house, it's diluted a little bit and it's not as direct as it would be if they were fully outside. So, the latest you want to start hardening off is those few weeks out, but starting to do it a bit earlier will not do them any harm and will actually probably do them some good in the long term.
When you talk about pinching that top portion off, are you talking about the leaves?
Yeah, so essentially the top growing stem of any plant produces a chemical hormone that suppresses all of the buds below it. So it wants to grow tall and straight. And when you nip off that top growing point, again, maybe ½ inch to an inch, you actually want to take some of the stem with it, not just the leaves. And you want to pinch down to a set of leaves. So you don't want a chunk of, let's pretend this is a plant stem. You don't want a stem chunk just hanging out, but let's say the next set of leaves starts right here. We want to pinch right to the top of those leaves. And so when we do that, it stops that production of plant hormone, and suddenly there's a hidden bud at each one of the leaf nodes on your stem. And by removing that plant hormone, poof, all of those side buds will sort of start to grow. And it's not just that, and it's not just that one, every plant stem produces that hormone. So if you wanted, the next 4 to 6, I wouldn't do this for most veggies because eventually we want them to produce food, but for shrubs and trees, longer growing plants that come back year to year, the more we pinch off those growing tips, the bushier things will be as things grow over time.
Well, as someone who has cosmos and zinnias lined up to go in their trays, that's a real eye-opener to me. So thank you for sharing that. That's
definitely
excited to get
and
back.
Another benefit of starting them early too, because if you waited to start them, you can sow those directly in the ground outdoors 6 to 8 weeks from now. But of course, even pinching them off, you might say, oh, well, if that delays flowering by 2 weeks, I don't want to do that. But that's the benefit of starting them early indoors, is you sort of overcome that, versus if you planted them outside, you might not get flowers till September, October. And so the benefit of starting indoors for sure.
Definitely. Love the idea of that. Thank you. I guess maybe one last thing related to grow lights is, do you use them at night? I mean, how do you know how often to run your lights?
So you really look to what's happening outside. We're seeing, we're coming up, let's see, we already hit the equinox, right? So our days are still getting longer. So, just looking at how many daylight hours we're having right now, but having about, I'm trying to think, it's maybe 10-ish hour, 10 to 12 hours a day, somewhere in that range. If the sun comes up at 7 and it goes down at 7:30, you can leave your lights on for that, at least that period of time, if not a bit longer, because remember, by the time they go out in summer, daylight hours will outnumber dark hours. But just like leaving the lights too far away from the plants, if you leave your grow lights on 24/7, it will also can cause them to be leggy and too long, because it's sort of too much of a good thing. So there is a Goldilocks factor to look for. And again, about 10 to 12 hours a day, if you're using a grow light, is sufficient. And again, a grow light, like if you're growing in a basement or a garage or somewhere where it's really dark, you'll definitely need them. If you're growing in a house where your only natural light is a north-facing window, again, a grow light can just be a nice supplement. It's less critical to their, overall lifespan, but it wouldn't be a bad extra investment to make.
I guess that's why, you see such big price differences, because if you can program when they're on, that's probably going to explain why you're seeing, a more costly model.
And honestly, from a cost perspective, I'm sure there are some that are all built in and fancy and, sort of the Cadillac of grow lights, but I've just gone to a hardware store and got a light timer like you'd use for a table lamp in your living room or something, because you can adjust those pretty easily, and they, you plug a small power strip into those, you get 3, 4, or 5 grow lights going, and they're all on that one switch circuit. Again, especially if it's LEDs, they're not pulling a lot of electric. Like, you're not going to probably, if your circuit breaker does trip, well, then you probably have a deeper problem, and I'm not an electrician. But that light timer is a good way. Those maybe run $15 or $20. They're not too expensive.
I think that's more of like when we do an electrician Q&A.
Yes. Defer that specific question for them. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Well, let's move along then. I thought one of the great things about the video was that idea of adding the water directly to the soil, and then, squeezing it out and making sure you have the right consistency to then put it in the container. But it does also make me wonder, like, if this connects to Anya's question in our chat. And I think probably a lot of people will have that same question, which is, house plants and then growing container gardens to eventually be moved out means that there might be some crossover of pests. So she was experiencing this fungal growth. Can you talk a little bit about that, like some concerns that people might see from invaders in their indoor seed starting?
So I'm looking at her question here. And so fungus gnats, it looks like specifically. So then those are sort of like the fruit fly things that just, if you have house plants and you start doing this a lot, that's that. So one of the actually easiest things to do, and we didn't cover this in the video, but that is a really, really good question. So fungal gnats, the adults, if there's exposed soil that's nice and soft and supple and easy to, so they burrow into that soil to lay their eggs. So what we want to try and do, the easiest, quickest way before we even break out any kind of chemicals is to try and provide a physical barrier. And so, you know, think about if you were this fungal gnat, you know, if you want to crawl into bed at night and it's nice and cozy, well, that's where you're going to go. But if you know, put sandpaper on top of your bed, you're not going to want to get in. So what you can do is, again, get basically a little bit of sharp, it's called sharp sand. It's like what you put in a sandbox. So it's not the, you can also use, there are more decorative sands out there that people use in terrariums. It's a bit more expensive. And unless you want to put blue or pink or red sand over the top of your, that's totally your call. But ultimately what we want to do is try and create a rough physical barrier over the top of the soil. And again, we're doing it, think of it like you're sprinkling salt on your dinner. You know, it doesn't need to be super thick. It just needs to, you know, just barely cover the top. So you can sort of get a pinch of it and just sprinkle over the top after you've sown your seeds. The seeds will pop right up through it. They won't care at all. You know, I wouldn't do something like pea gravel. That's too big. You know, you're really looking for sand. You can also use, I've seen vermiculite or perlite, which again are some of the components of typical potting soil. You can buy them just straight without being mixed into something else. And again, those you can spread just over the top. And again, the perlite and vermiculite especially they float on water. So that's just another reason to sort of water from below if you're doing that, because otherwise they'll just sort of float away off of your container. Sand is probably actually what I've seen used most often and seems to have the best result. And again, you can use that same approach in houseplants if you have them, just sort of putting that rough barrier on the top of the soil. And the reason we do that after we plant the seeds rather than before is if you're planting the seeds, you're probably digging those holes, you're disturbing the soil, and more, you know, you may be opening up a new place for those fungal gnats to crawl back inside. So think about the sand as like the finishing touch after sowing.
Could you use that? I'm not going to get this right, but I'm going to say something like biocutaneous earth. Is that right?
Biochar? Is that what you're thinking of? Or
no, I think it's biosedacious earth. It's like very, very fine, sharp particles of seashell.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is as long as it's the super fine diatomaceous earths. Yeah, thank you, Anya.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, as long as you're looking for particles again that are about the size of sand, you know, pea gravel, which again is probably fingernail size or so, is far too big. We're looking for, and again, seeds will have a hard time pushing through anything that's too large. So just if you look for that particle size that is basically about like what you'd find in a sandbox, that's sort of the right place to look for.
Okay, so will that get rid of what she's already got, or are they like here to stay, and then you just do that with the next thing, or?
No, so essentially, if you were to apply that now, again, to houseplants and/or seed trays, you'll still have the adults for a few days, because essentially what you're doing by putting that layer down is disrupting their life cycle. So, you know, you're not dropping an insect bomb in your house, of course. So again, the adults might hang around until they die. They don't have a long lifespan. But you know, over maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks, you should see that population decline or disappear.
Great.
But again, it is something I would do for the houseplants before you start your seeds. And another sort of general tip that we sort of briefly touched on this in the video, but this is sort of adjacent, is sanitation. So if you're reusing containers, again, we mentioned something like egg cartons or salad trays that you might have, you know, had around the house, or old seed trays, you know, you're using from year to year. If you're using plastic seed trays, give them like a quick bleach dunk bath, like a really gentle bleach solution. If it's egg trays, especially the porous ones, or plastic salad boxes, again, either spray them with a gentle bleach solution or alcohol solution. We just want to disinfect as much as possible, because there can be, again, fungus, pathogens, things that carry over. And don't ever reuse potting soil for seeds. Always use fresh potting soil that'll be clean and sterile. If we reuse any of those materials, there's a chance that what's most commonly seen is what's called dampening off. And that's when you'll have this great seed going gangbusters, and then suddenly it just sort of like it looks like it had a weak point near the soil, and it just sort of flops over and it dies. And that's dampening off, and that's usually because there was a sanitation issue somewhere, or we overwatered. And so that's the other reason to, if you have water standing in your tray after watering, empty it out. Don't just wait for the soil to soak it up eventually. As you're watering, again, doing it slowly. And once you see standing water, empty out that tray if you get to that point, because that can also encourage fungal gnats, pest diseases, all kinds of things. So too much water is a bad thing, and also just making sure everything you start with is clean.
Great.
And you don't have to like wear a mask and gloves or anything like that. That shouldn't be a huge issue, but you know, sanitation is always a good thing.
Cool. Last year I noticed when I had my Cosmo trays in that stage of going from inside to outside, some of them had developed like what I thought was like a spider web, like webbing, maybe cocooning. Can you explain what that might be and how to get rid of it?
That, especially if you have other indoor plants, that could be spider mites, which is another thing that we'll find on, you know, indoor house plants from time to time. If that's probably my guess, because almost positively. Again, and what I would probably say is, before you start your seeds, again, doing a deep clean and inspection of your houseplants, if possible. You know, if you have a deck or a patio where things are warm enough to, you know, again, some of these days we'll be having are warm enough, start moving those indoor plants outside for short periods of time, because as our native insects start to sort of come alive, you know, a lot of them will prey on some of those indoor pests. So like they'll help to keep those under control. The UV light, the more intense UV light, can help with some of those things too. So that's probably your quickest, most natural treatment. You can also sort of bathe your, you know, neem oil is another organic treatment you can sort of spray on and wipe off. So just make sure your indoor plants are super clean before seed starting. But if you do see those on your Cosmos, or you do see some of those things start to pop up, again, if the weather's nice enough and you can start pre-hardening them off, you know, early, or moving them outdoors, that can help. I haven't used neem oil on seedlings before, so I would maybe just do a little bit more research on that. But I think, again, trying to have your environment be as clean and sanitation as possible before starting is your best prevention, rather than, you know, treatment, essentially.
Sure. What about Anya's suggestion of possibly using chamomile tea for dampening off?
That I don't know for sure. That I haven't heard of that myself personally, but it doesn't mean it doesn't work. But again, I maybe would just do some more Googling from reputable sources to find that one out.
All right. And then Gabriel has a question about sustainability in terms of potting soil, like the idea of constantly reusing new. How would you address that?
Thank you for asking this question. So yes, this gets at a really, this is sort of an emerging idea in horticulture right now. And that is that most of our seed mixes especially, and a lot of our indoor potting soil too, relies on peat moss. And peat is a non-renewable resource. So peat has to be mined from, you know, swamps, marshes, things like that. And once it, again, this is the precursor to coal, essentially. And it takes many, many years to form under pressure. And once it's gone, it's gone. It also is releasing carbon. There's a lot of carbon stored in that peat. And so peat mining is pretty destructive. Now there are companies emerging. And I'm blanking on their names right now, of course, but if you just Google peat-free potting soil, there are companies that are starting to sell this, and garden centers can carry it. Maybe the co-op can get a pallet or two for folks. But they essentially have remade the ingredient recipes, and they use a combination of things like coconut fiber is one option, is sort of the base replacement for peat. Because really, seeds start great in really loose soil that's fairly low in nutrients, and peat works great for that. But coconut fiber, of course, is a renewable resource, and it's also often a waste product for other things. So again, ask your garden center, ask the co-op to find, you know, some of these sources may not be available for mail order. They may only be available for sort of bulk ordering right now. So it may be one of those, like, sort of, you know, berate your garden center / the co-op to order a few pallets. But yeah, that is a really excellent question. You know, the other option for reusing soil, you know, and again, I would recommend just starting fresh. You can also make those soils at home. You can buy the raw ingredients like the coconut coir you can buy is basically bricks that you have to rehydrate. And there, people have posted sort of their own homemade recipes for seed starting. You'll have to buy, again, it might be like sand and I'm blanking on some of the other ingredients right now, but people have posted, you can just sort of mix them in a bucket or a wheelbarrow and make your own. But if you did want to reuse soil, you can also bake it. So basically putting it on a cookie tray and putting it in the oven at a decent, 150, 200 degrees and letting it bake. And that can kill off pathogens as well. But that's a lot of work and potentially a lot of mess. If you can find those peat-free sources, that's where I would go. But asking for peat-free, yes, that is please do that. That's great.
Well, and then maybe Gabriel and others who are listening, that's a good reason to come back, because we are going to be devoting one of these sessions just to the idea of, I don't know, is green gardening a redundant thing?
Ecological, well, not really. It's a lot of our traditional horticulture is not very sustainable, really. Plastics, our use of peat. A lot of us, you walk into most garden centers and big box stores and there's just aisles of chemicals. So, there's definitely, I wouldn't say that organic or ecological gardening is anywhere near as mainstream as it probably needs to be at this point. So.
Great. So Gabriel, tune in with us next week, because we're going to take a deeper dive into, what really hardcore sustainable green gardening can be, and look at things like peat and other topics. We'll get into it a little bit more. So, all right. Well, thank you for that. So we're going to kind of jump around here, because there's been other topics that have come up that are really not related to what we've already discussed. And I want to get some of them in here just so you can, cover all the bases.
Sure.
And some of the things that I don't know if this is really fitting with seed starting, but we did have a couple of questions with folks talking about putting in bulbs. So I know this is the time of year people are thinking about that as well. So do you want to talk a little bit about, I guess, like for me, my top question is, are there spring bulbs versus fall bulbs? Like what are people looking at now in terms of bulbs?
Yes, there's spring bulbs, there's fall bulbs, and there's last chance bulbs. That's what I'll call them. So, and last chance bulbs are the ones that typically are planted in fall, but if you still have them right now, it's worth a shot. As a great example of this, a friend gifted me some allium bulbs that she came across, and she was like, we'll see what happens and we'll give them a shot. And so as I opened them up, so fall bulbs, I should say, I'll back up a little bit. Fall bulbs are typically things that are blooming now. Crocus, daffodils, tulips, hyacinth, those things that bloom really early in spring, because they need to be in the ground and get going already. If we planted them now, if they do bloom, they might be delayed, compared to, other their counterparts, which have been in the ground all year. If you bought some of those bulbs last fall, or again, someone gifted them to you, inspect them before you plant. It's like if you're pulling an onion out of the pantry and it's kind of gooey and weird colors, like don't eat that. Don't plant any of those bulbs that aren't firm, that aren't consistent colors. If they're squishy, if there's brown or what looks like mold or fungus growing, just pitch them. Don't eat. I wouldn't bother trying to plant those. But a lot of this fall planted spring flowering bulbs, if we still have those, they may be sprouting already. Again, if you go into the cabinet and your onion or your garlic starting to grow, plant it. It's ready to go. You pop those in the soil. Those allium that were gifted to me, I put them in, I think maybe 2 weeks ago, and most of them are already up. I mean, they have not missed a moment. They're a little bit behind the
sprouty garlic. The little sprouty garlic, you can just put it in the ground.
Well, garlic from grocery stores is a little different because it depends on what it is. If it was grown organically, you can probably try and plant it. If it wasn't organic garlic, there's a chance it was treated with a growth suppressant. And this goes for like sweet potatoes or things you might get from the grocery store to try and start yourself for veggie gardening. They might start to grow and then kind of go and just stop. And potatoes, root crops, things like that. Those I would typically try and get from a garden center or garden retailer rather than grocery store. Only because things might start and then kind of just peter out if that chemical kicks in or something like that. Again, you can always try, but just sort of as a note of caution for that. My alliums in this case were just the flowering. They weren't edible. It's just the ornamental ones, which I think is why I'm able to get away with it, because they wouldn't have been treated with anything. But all that said, there are also spring planted bulbs. And so those are going to be things like gladiolas and cannas, dahlias. And these are the things that typically will bloom far later into the summer, June, July, August, September. And they also tend to not be hardy for us, which means we'll either need to replant them a new crop next spring or dig them up and overwinter them to replant out again next year, which again, a lot of people do. Those bulbs want really warm soil conditions. I think most of them are something like 60 to 70 degrees soil conditions before they even go outside. So you can order those now. You might see them in garden, a lot of garden centers may be carrying them already, but do not be tempted to plant them out yet. It's still too cold. Again, we want to wait till the soil, at least our frost-free date, sort of again, mid to late May. You're probably in the clear by that point, but it might even be end of May, early June for some of them. Okay. Again, the packet should say what the soil temp wants to be before they go in. But if you have space indoors and pots and soil for something like dahlias, you could pot them up and start them indoors just to sort of, again, get them growing sooner like we would seeds. But you certainly don't have to. That would just give you a jump start. And again, that's a lot of work, but only if you really have the space. Okay.
I'm going to do something really mean, which is take a U-turn back to seed starting.
Go for it.
I forgot that I had listed here a question that came in about when we're talking about watering. I have a friend who really thinks that misting is important, but I've never seen or heard that anywhere. Is that, you're talking about watering from below, so I don't really get why misting would work.
I mean, misting doesn't not work. And actually, confessional moment, I've been misting my seedlings this year only because the trays I bought, the under tray and the top tray, don't fit like they're supposed to. So I don't have consistent, the trays aren't reaching the water consistently below them. And so I basically have to mist them at this point because I just have no other option. Misting isn't bad by any means, but it does usually, it's more labor intensive. You've got to sit there and pull the trigger to mist every cell, and some cells may dry out sooner than others. It may not be consistent. So that's, misting, I think, is more a question of how much daily attention and time and how many, if you have 10 trays of seeds you're doing, if you're really doing a big thing, that's a lot of misting, unless you've created an automated system. Versus watering the bottom of the tray takes 25 seconds and you sort of watered everything consistently at one time. One cell or two might start to dry out before the others, but they probably will all need to be watered again at about the same time. But from a plant health perspective, in my experience, there's they both work. We're both, what we don't want to do is just like dump water on top of the soil. And the reason for that is top watering in high volume can compact the soil. And again, we want that soil to stay as loose as possible. Also, if your seeds are little or haven't germinated yet, they can just wash away if they're, sown on the surface. So that's why we either water from below again, or you can mist, but I think the misting is probably more a question of but if also your gardening is zen and you want to sort of take the time to mist every one, that's totally fine. Again, I think from a health perspective, either works. It's a big question of time.
What do you say to those folks out there, like myself, who just cannot be told that, putting 30 or 40 seeds per container is a bad idea?
And sometimes we don't have a choice, right? It depends on the seeds. Like snapdragons, I mean, they're dust. Like if you tried to get 2 or 3 ones per, forget it. Like that's not going to happen. You're gonna have like 15 or 20 per cell. Another option could be, and again, depends on how much work you want to put into this, but rather than using the cells, the trays essentially just getting, again, like a salad container is a good example of this, or even a lid from an egg carton and just filling it and sort of scattering them all over the surface. And then what you'll do is wait until they're maybe an inch or so, have their first true leaves at least, and then do what's called pricking out. And so you'd go in with like a spoon or something and sort of basically scoop out the babies gently, repot them then in cell trays. And again, that's a lot of finessing and handling, which again, if you have the time to do that, you certainly can. And actually, you'll probably get, depending on how much you want to grow, you'll probably get more plants out of that than sowing in cells and thinning out from the cells. Is when we thin out from cells, we usually have to be pretty aggressive. Like the plants that come out, I wouldn't try to replant. Like we're kind of hard on them. But when we prick out from just an open sowing, you know, we're being really, really gentle. You know, there might be a little bit of transplant shock, but we're typically moving them when they're a bit larger. And you can, you know, almost every plant in there is probably going to be viable and you could pot up. So it's a question of, you know, the size of, you know, if you're doing something like sunflowers, those are, you know, so big and easy to handle. It really probably comes down to the size of the seed you're growing and how many actual plants you have room for and want to. If you want a whole flat of snapdragons, the pricking out method might work really well.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great idea.
You only want 6 or 8. I would still sow them in the cells and then just thin the cells once they get big enough.
Yeah, definitely. I really like the idea of, you know, thinking outside of that little tiny container and realizing that if the seeds are too
you don't have to, that can be phase 2. You can start, you know, a phase even, that doesn't have to be your starting point. Yeah.
Exactly. Great. Well, we're in our final minutes, and I guess I wanted to ask you before we left, like, with things that you have started from seed, what kind of surprise things have you done that you were really excited about the results of? Or, you know, are there a lot of folks really like heirloom seeds? Are there heirloom seeds that you've tried that you would recommend? Tell us some of your success stories.
Well, I think the good news is if you're growing food, it's usually pretty easy because most food are annuals, and you know the good news is they're ready to go. They don't need too much special treatment. Again, I think the biggest, you know, I've also been trying to start native plants from seed this year, and that's a whole other kettle of everything. So if you've ever dabbled in native seed, and this is where it's kind of, it can really be a labor of love. You know, some need to be sown outdoors in the fall. Some need to be sort of in a moist bag that's in your fridge for 2 to 3 months. Some need to be sown in a tray and stuck in the, you know, and some can be sown directly in the ground. So that's probably, you know, when any of those, you know, I'm such a nut for just like buying actual plants, because for native plants, especially because again, so the seed is, if I was running a nursery full time and that was my, you know, if that was my gig and I was an expert in it, I wouldn't mind. But for my home gardening, for my personal gardening, for those, I usually prefer to go buy a plant because starting seeds can be such a oof. But for some of these native plants, you also can't find them as transplants, or they don't transplant well. So seed is kind of your own. Some of them you have to soak in water. Some of them you have to scratch with a razor blade to break the seed coat. You know, there's just a lot of different, you know, because you know, think of all the ways these plants grow in nature. A lot of them are perennials. A lot of those seeds can sit in the soil for years and wait for a brush fire or, you know, something to come along and eat them and then poop them out. And that's what breaks the seed coat. So there's a lot of, you know, nature is a really creative thing. And again, a lot of those seeds have those protections to protect the seed. But that's a whole different everything than growing veggies and herbs that are annuals, and annuals are like, we don't need that protection. We just need to grow. We need to flower and set seed and do it all over again. So, you know, I think the good news is if that's where you're starting, it's a really easy way to get started. You're probably going to set yourself up for success if you do that. What I would say is be cautious. You know, again, not everything is built to start indoors too. You know, peas, for instance, you know, you can start them indoors, but really they like cool weather. You know, usually it's around St. Patrick's Day for sometimes that peas will go outside in the ground. You know, people can start sunflowers.
Earlier than I thought. That's earlier than I would think.
You know, and greens too, you know, lettuces, spinaches, they prefer it cooler. So, you know, those you might even be able to start sowing outdoors in the next couple of weeks. You know, those I just wouldn't start indoors in seed trays because like you certainly can, but it's like, why bother? They grow really quickly. You can plant multiple crops outside. You can plant them early. You know, a lot of what we usually try and start indoors are things that like heat and take a long time to mature. So again, anything in the tomato family, the nightshade family. So again, eggplant, tomatoes, okra, all of those, peppers, you know, all of those are in the same plant family. They need a long time. So yeah, I think but I will say in terms of like surprises or happy accidents, when I do actually get a native plant to come true from seed, that's fun. But it's, you know, I'm still learning and I'm still figuring that out as I go. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ben. That's really great. And I guess next week we're back with ecological gardening. So
Yes, indeed.
get more into some of the things that Gabriel brought up and beyond. So thank you for joining us again, and thanks to everyone who attended. And once again, this has been recorded, so we'll make it available to everyone sometime later this week. Excuse me. That's it. Thanks, everyone. See you again.
Thank you so much.